channel to receive further notifications. Please click on the like button and share this video as much as you can.
The Munich Massacre was an attack during the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich, West Germany, by 8 members of the Palestinian terrorist group Black September, who took 9 members of the Israeli Olympic team hostage, after killing 2 of them previously, and killing them along with a West German police officer. Black September called the operation Ikrit and Bayram, after 2 Palestinian Christian villages whose inhabitants were expelled by the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The Black September commander was Latif Afif, who was also the negotiator. West German neo-Nazis gave the group logistical assistance. On Monday evening, the 4th of September 1972, Israeli athletes enjoyed a night out, watching a performance of Fiddler on the Roof and dining with the star of the play, Israeli actor Shmuel Rodensky, before returning to the Olympic Village. On the return trip in the team bus, Lalkin denied his 13-year-old son, who had befriended weightlifter Yosef Romano and wrestler Ilza Hafin, permission to spend the night in their apartment at Conlistras 31, which probably saved the boy's life. At 4:30 a.m. local time on the 5th of September 1972, as the athletes slept, 8 tracksuit-clad members of the Black September faction of the Palestine Liberation Organization, carrying duffel bags loaded with AKM assault rifles, Tokef pistols, and grenades, scaled a 2-meter (6.5 feet) chain-link fence with the assistance of unsuspecting athletes who were also sneaking into the Olympic Village. The athletes were originally identified as Americans, but were claimed to be Canadians decades later. Once inside, the group used stolen keys to enter 2 apartments being used by the Israeli team at Conlistras 31. Yosef Gutfreund, a wrestling referee, was awakened by a faint scratching noise at the door of apartment 1, which housed the Israeli coaches and officials. When he investigated, he saw the door begin to open and masked men with guns on the other side. He shouted a warning to his sleeping roommates and threw his 135 kilograms, 300 pounds, weight against the door in a futile attempt to stop the intruders from forcing their way in. Gutfreund's actions gave his roommate, weightlifting coach Tuvia Sokolovsky, enough time to smash a window and escape. Wrestling coach Moshe Weinberg fought the intruders, who shot him through his cheek and then forced him to help them find more hostages. Leading the intruders past apartment 2, Weinberg lied by telling them that the residents of the apartment were not Israelis. Instead, Weinberg led them to apartment 3, where the gunman corralled 6 wrestlers and weightlifters as additional hostages. It is possible that Weinberg had hoped that the stronger men would have a better chance of fighting off the attackers than those in apartment 2, but they were all surprised in their sleep. As the athletes from apartment 3 were marched back to the coach's apartment, the wounded Weinberg again attacked the gunman, allowing one of his wrestlers, Gad Sobari, to escape via the underground parking garage. Weinberg knocked unconscious one of the intruders and slashed at another with a fruit knife but failed to draw blood before being shot to death. Weightlifter Yosef Romano, a veteran of the 1967 Six-Day War, also attacked and wounded one of the intruders before being shot and killed. In its publication of the 1st of December 2015, the New York Times reported that Romano was castrated after he was shot. The gunmen were left with 9 hostages. They were, in addition to Gutfreund, sharpshooting coach Kihat Shur, track and field coach Amitsa Shapira, fencing master Andre Spitzer, weightlifting judge Yakov Springer, wrestlers Ilza Hafin and Mark Slavin, and weightlifters David Berger and Zeph Friedman. Berger was an expatriate American with dual citizenship. Slavin, at 18 the youngest of the hostages, had only arrived in Israel from the Soviet Union 4 months before the Olympic Games began. Gutfreund, physically the largest of the hostages, was bound to a chair. Graussert describes him as being tied up like a mummy. The rest were lined up 4 apiece on the 2 beds in Springer and Shapira's room, and bound at the wrists and ankles and then to each other. Romano's bullet-riddled corpse was left at his bound comrades' feet as a warning. Several of the hostages were beaten during the standoff, with some suffering broken bones as a result. Of the other members of Israel's team, racewalker Shaul Ladany had been jolted awake in apartment 2 by Gutfreund's screams. He jumped from the second-story balcony of his room and fled to the American dormitory, awakening U.S. track coach Bill Bowerman and informing him of the attack. Ledeny, a survivor of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, was the first person to spread the alert. The other four residents of apartment 2, sharpshooters Henry Hirschkautz and Zelig Strock, fencers Danilon and Yehuda Weisenstein, plus chef de mission Shmuel Lalkin and the two team doctors, hid and eventually fled the besieged building. The two female members of Israel's Olympic team, sprinter and hurdler Esther Shea Hamoroff and swimmer Shlomitner, were housed in a separate part of the Olympic Village. Three more members of Israel's Olympic team, two sailors and their manager, were housed in Kiel, 900 kilometers, 600 miles, from Munich. The attackers were reported to be Palestinian terrorists from refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. They were identified as Latif Afif, using the code name Issa, the leader. Three of Issa's brothers were also reportedly members of Black September, two of them in Israeli jails, his deputy Yusuf Natsal, Tony, and junior members Afif Ahmed Hamid, Paulo, Khalid Jawad, Salah, Ahmed Sheiktha, Abu Hawla, Muhammad Saifadi, Badran, Adnan al-Ghashi, Denoy, and al-Ghashi's cousin, Jamal al-Ghashi, Samia. According to author Simon Reeve, Afif, the son of a Jewish mother and Christian father, Natsal, and one of their confederates, had all worked in various capacities in the Olympic Village, and had spent a couple of weeks scouting for their potential target. A member of the Uruguayan Olympic delegation, which shared housing with the Israelis, claimed that he found Natsal inside 31 Conlisterus less than 24 hours before the attack, but since he was recognized as a worker in the village, nothing was thought of it at the time. The other members of the group entered Munich via train and plane in the days before the attack. All the members of the Uruguay and Hong Kong Olympic teams, which also shared the building with the Israelis, were released unharmed during the attack. The hostage-takers demanded the release of 234 Palestinians and non-Arabs jailed in Israel, along with two West German insurgents held by the West German penitentiary system, Andreas Bader and Ulrich Meinhof, who were founders of the West German Red Army faction. The hostage-takers threw the body of Weinberg out of the front door of the residence to demonstrate their resolve. Israel's response was immediate and absolute: there would be no negotiation. Israel's official policy at the time was to refuse to negotiate with terrorists under any circumstances, as according to the Israeli government such negotiations would give an incentive to future attacks. It has been claimed that the German authorities, under the leadership of Chancellor Willy Brandt and Minister for the Interior Hans-Dietrich Genscher, rejected Israel's offer to send an Israeli Special Forces unit to West Germany. The Bavarian Interior Minister Bruno Merk, who headed the crisis center jointly with Genscher and Munich's police chief Manfred Schreiber, denies that such an Israeli offer ever existed. According to journalist John K. Cooley, the hostage situation presented an extremely difficult political situation for the Germans because the hostages were Jewish. Cooley reported that the Germans offered the Palestinians an unlimited amount of money for the release of the athletes, as well as the substitution by high-ranking Germans. However, the kidnappers refused both offers. Munich police chief Manfred Schreiber, and Bruno Merk, Interior Minister of Bavaria, negotiated directly with the kidnappers, repeating the offer of an unlimited amount of money. According to Cooley, the reply was that money means nothing to us, our lives mean nothing to us. Magdi Gohari and Mohammed Kadif, both Egyptian advisors to the Arab League, and Adi Towney, an Egyptian member of the International Olympic Committee, IOC, also helped try to win concessions from the kidnappers, but to no avail. However, the negotiators apparently were able to convince the terrorists that their demands were being considered, as ISA granted a total of 5 deadline extensions. Elsewhere in the village, athletes carried on as normal, seemingly oblivious of the events unfolding nearby. The games continued until mounting pressure on the IOC forced a suspension some 12 hours after the first athlete had been murdered. United States marathon runner Frank Shorter, observing the unfolding events from the balcony of his nearby lodging, was quoted as saying, "Imagine those poor guys over there. Every 5 minutes a psycho with a machine gun says, 'Let's kill him now,' and someone else says, 'No, let's wait a while.' How long could you stand that?" At 4:30 p.m., a squad of 38 West German police officers was dispatched to the Olympic Village. Dressed in Olympic sweatsuits, some also wearing Stahlhelm and carrying Walther MP submachine guns, they were members of the German border police, although according to former Munich policeman Heinz Hohensen they were regular Munich police officers, with no experience in combat or hostage rescue. Their plan was to crawl down from the ventilation shafts and kill the terrorists. The police took up positions awaiting the code word sunshine, which upon hearing, they were to begin the assault. In the meantime, camera crews filmed the actions of the officers from the German apartments, and broadcast the images live on television. Thus, the terrorists were able to watch the police prepare to attack. Footage shows one of the kidnappers peering from the balcony door while one of the police officers stood on the roof less than 20 feet, 6 meters, from him. In the end, after Issa threatened to kill 2 of their hostages, the police retreated from the premises. At one point during the crisis, the negotiators demanded direct contact with the hostages to satisfy themselves the Israelis were still alive. Fencing coach Andrei Spitzer, who spoke fluent German, and shooting coach Kehat Shor, the senior member of the Israeli delegation, had a brief conversation with West German officials while standing at the second-floor window of the besieged building, with 2 kidnappers holding guns on them. When Spitzer attempted to answer a question, he was clubbed with the butt of an AK-47 in full view of international television cameras and pulled away from the window. A few minutes later, Hans-Dietrich Genscher and Walter Trogger, the mayor of the Olympic Village, were briefly allowed into the apartments to speak with the hostages. Trogger spoke of being very moved by the dignity with which the Israelis held themselves, and that they seemed resigned to their fate. Trogger noticed that several of the hostages, especially Gutfreund, showed signs of having suffered physical abuse at the hands of the kidnappers, and that David Berger had been shot in his left shoulder. While being debriefed by the crisis team, Genscher and Trogger told them that they had seen 4 or 5 attackers inside the apartment. Fatefully, these numbers were accepted as definitive. While Genscher and Trogger were talking with the hostages, Kehat Shor had told their West Germans that the Israelis would not object to being flown to an Arab country, provided that strict guarantees for their safety were made by the Germans and whichever nation they landed in. At 6 p.m. Munich time, the Palestinians issued a new dictate, demanding transportation to Cairo. The West Germans had not arranged for armored personnel carriers ahead of time and only at this point were they called in to break the deadlock. Since the roads to the airport had not been cleared, the carriers became stuck in traffic and finally arrived around midnight. With their appearance, the kidnappers felt the shift in the status quo, and possibly panicked at the thought of the failure of their operation. At 4 minutes past midnight of the 6th of September, one of them, likely Issa, turned on the hostages in the eastern helicopter and fired at them with a Kalashnikov assault rifle from point-blank range. Springer, Harfin and Friedman were killed instantly. Berger, shot twice in the leg, is believed to have survived the initial onslaught, as his autopsy later found that he had died of smoke inhalation. The attacker then pulled the pin on a hand grenade and tossed it into the cockpit. The ensuing explosion destroyed the helicopter and incinerated the bound Israelis inside. Issa then dashed across the tarmac and began firing at the police, who killed him with return fire. Another, Khalid Jawad, attempted to escape and was gunned down by one of the snipers. What happened to the remaining hostages is still a matter of dispute. A German police investigation indicated that one of their snipers and a few of the hostages may have been shot inadvertently by the police. However, a Time magazine reconstruction of the long-suppressed Bavarian prosecutor's report indicates that a third kidnapper, Reeve identifies Adnan al-Ghashi, stood at the door of the Western helicopter and raked the remaining 5 hostages with machine gun fire. Gutfreund, Schur, Slavin, Spitzer and Shapira were shot an average of 4 times each. Of the 4 hostages in the Eastern helicopter, only Zef Friedman's body was relatively intact. He had been blown clear of the helicopter by the explosion. In some cases, the exact cause of death for the hostages in the Eastern helicopter was difficult to establish because the rest of the corpses were burned almost beyond recognition in the explosion and subsequent fire. 3 of the remaining men lay on the ground, one of them feigning death, and were captured by police. Jamal al-Ghashi had been shot through his right wrist, and Mohammed Saif Adi had sustained a flesh wound to his leg. Adnan al-Ghashi had escaped injury completely. Tony escaped the scene, but was tracked down with police dogs 40 minutes later in an airbase parking lot. Cornered and bombarded with tear gas, he was shot dead after a brief gunfight. By around 1:30 a.m. on the 6th of September, the battle was over. The bodies of the 5 Palestinian attackers, Afif, Natsal, Sheikha, Hamad and Juml, killed during the First Anfal gun battle were delivered to Libya, where they received heroes' funerals and were buried with full military honors. 55. On the 8th of September, Israeli planes bombed 10 PLO bases in Syria and Lebanon in response to the massacre, killing scores of militants and civilians. 56. The 3 surviving Black September gunmen had been arrested after the First Anfal gunfight, and were being held in a Munich prison for trial. On the 29th of October, Lufthansa Flight 615 was hijacked and threatened to be blown up if the Munich attackers were not released. Safadi and the Al-Ghashis were immediately released by West Germany, receiving a tumultuous welcome when they touched down in Libya and, as seen in One Day in September, giving their own first-hand account of their operation at a press conference broadcast worldwide. Further international investigations into the Lufthansa Flight 615 incident have produced theories of a secret agreement between the German government and Black September release of the surviving terrorists in exchange for assurances of no further attacks on Germany. In the wake of the hostage-taking, competition was suspended for 34 hours, for the first time in modern Olympic history. 61, after public criticism of the Olympic Committee's decision to continue the Games. On the 6th of September, a memorial service attended by 80,000 spectators and 3,000 athletes was held in the Olympic Stadium. IOC President Avery Brundage made little reference to the murdered athletes during a speech praising the strength of the Olympic movement and equating the attack on the Israeli sportsmen with the recent arguments about encroaching professionalism and disallowing Rhodesia's participation in the Games, which outraged many listeners. The victims' families were represented by Andrei Spitzer's widow Anki, Moshe Weinberg's mother, and a cousin of Weinberg, Carmel Eliash. During the memorial service, Eliash collapsed and died of a heart attack. Many of the 80,000 people who filled the Olympic Stadium for West Germany's football match with Hungary carried noisemakers and waved flags, but when several spectators unfurled a banner reading 17 dead, already forgotten, security officers removed the sign and expelled those responsible from the grounds. During the memorial service, the Olympic flag was flown at half-staff, along with the flags of most of the other competing nations at the request of Willy Brandt. 10 Arab nations objected to their flags flying at half-staff and the mandate was rescinded. Willy Daum, president of the Munich Organizing Committee, initially sought to cancel the remainder of the Games, but in the afternoon Brundage and others who wished to continue the Games prevailed, stating that they could not let the incident halt the Games. Brundage stated the Games must go on, and we must continue our efforts to keep them clean, pure and honest. The decision was endorsed by the Israeli government and Israeli Olympic team chef de mission Shmuel Lalkin. On the 6th of September, after the memorial service, the remaining members of the Israeli team withdrew from the Games and left Munich. All Jewish sportsmen were placed under guard. Mark Spitz, the American swimming star who had already completed his competitions, left Munich during the hostage crisis. It was feared that as a prominent Jew, Spitz might be a kidnapping target. The Egyptian team left the Games on the 7th of September, stating they feared reprisals. The Philippine and Algerian teams also left the Games, as did some members of the Dutch and Norwegian teams. American marathon runner Kenny Moore, who wrote about the incident for Sports Illustrated, quoted Dutch distance runner Joseph Hermans as saying it's quite simple. We were invited to a party, and if someone comes to the party and shoots people, how can you stay? Many athletes, dazed by the tragedy, similarly felt that their desire to compete had been destroyed, although they stayed at the Games. 4 years later at the 1976 Summer Olympics in Montreal, the Israeli team commemorated the massacre. When they entered the stadium at the opening ceremony, their national flag was adorned with a black ribbon. After all this, you may think that how Israel failed in this whole operation. If you think this, you are totally wrong. Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir and the Israeli Defense Committee secretly authorized Mossad, the intelligence agency of Israel, to track down and kill those allegedly responsible for the Munich massacre. The accusation that this was motivated by a desire for vengeance was disputed by Zvi Meir, who described the mission as putting an end to the type of terror that was perpetrated in Europe. To this end, Mossad set up a number of special teams to locate and kill these Fedouin, aided by the agency's stations in Europe. How Israel cracked down all terrorists and how the revenge operation lasted for nearly 30 years. All this and much more will be discussed in the next video. This video is going to be much more interesting than this video. You will be shocked with the Israeli response operation, which is also called as Wrath of God. Stay tuned. Till
To
then,
receive
goodbye.
further notifications, please click on the like button and share this video as much as you can.